Events sure do move fast across the channel. From Friday's booze at St. Paul's Cathedral's Queen Jubilee Thanksgiving service to a Monday morning leadership challenge at Westminster, the Conservative revolt against the Prime Minister seems to have suddenly gone into overdrive. With two big by-elections coming up, why set the wheels in motion now? Is Partygate coming home to roost, or the ruling Conservatives already changing course as post-Brexit turbulence blurs into the worst inflation in decades? What kind of leadership do Tory faithful want? What kind of Britain do they want? The United Kingdom's coming off 4 days of a Jubilee that wasn't so much a celebration, but a public show of recognition to mark the twilight of a monarch whose reign has lasted 70 years. What lies ahead? That's the great unknown. Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if it's the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson. Joining us from London, Alice Lilly, senior researcher at the Institute for Government think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
From London, historian and commentator David Alroyd-Bolt. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Francois. Lovely to be back.
From Oslo, Sunny Kapoor, professor of geoeconomics at the European University Institute. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me again.
Catherine Cohen of the Sorbonne University's Center for Research on the English-Speaking World joins us as well. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. When the day began, a solid favorite to keep his jobs, say the bookmaker. The Reuters news agency says 145 Conservative MPs back Boris Johnson. The magic number is 181 to survive the leadership contest. But what are his chances of finishing the year at Downing Street? Catherine Viette has more.
Boris Johnson's leadership is on the line after 15% of his party members submitted letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister's ability to do his job.
A confidence vote obviously will provide a clear answer. The party will have confidence in the leadership or not have confidence in the leadership. That's the question that will be before my colleagues today.
For Johnson to be forced out as Prime Minister, at least half of the Conservative MPs must vote against him. Once seen as a charismatic leader that helped the Conservative Party win a huge parliamentary majority in 2019, the Prime Minister has been plagued by a string of scandals since then. Most notably, what's been dubbed Partygate, a series of revelations that Downing Street flouted lockdown rules at a time when pandemic restrictions prevented the rest of the country from social interactions, including visits to dying relatives or to attend funerals. In April, more than 100 members of the government, including Johnson, were fined for breaking the rules for boozy gatherings at work.
I've received a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. And let me say immediately that I've paid the fine and I once again offer a full apology.
And criticism of Johnson's actions has only grown since a report by senior civil servant Sue Gray was released in May. The report found a drunken culture of alcohol-fueled parties held by Downing Street staff that ignored warnings that such gatherings could be illegal. The Prime Minister said he took full responsibility for everything that took place on his watch, but that's done little to appease the public, which booed Johnson during the Queen's Jubilee celebrations this weekend. After electoral losses in local elections in early May and plummeting approval ratings, many Conservatives now see Johnson's leadership as a liability.
Alice Lilly, many of us on this side of the channel caught a little off guard by this leadership contest happening this Monday morning. Is it about those boos?
I think they certainly won't have helped. That's certainly something that Conservative MPs will have seen last weekend, and that possibly will have troubled some of them. But I think in reality, this has actually been coming for a little while now, ever since those first allegations of partying Downing Street emerged several months ago and have sort of continued since then. We've started to see more and more Conservative MPs become critical of the Prime Minister. After that Sue Gray report that you just mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that criticism started to just become a little bit more noticeable. And so I think there'd been a lot of speculation over the weekend that they had reached that magic number of 54, which means that they have to hold this vote. So I think when that was announced this morning, it didn't come as a huge surprise. What perhaps is a bit more surprising is the fact that the vote is taking place tonight. It's happening as we speak right now. That's perhaps a little bit sooner than we anticipated, but people say that a week is a long time in politics, and obviously that's been the case here in the UK.
Just a word on who was booing, because people showing up to watch the royals go in for a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral. What kind of constituency is that?
I think the expectation would be that the kinds of people who were turning up to something like that would be people who might be a little bit more predisposed to the Conservative Party, perhaps. I mean, it's hard to say. We don't obviously know exactly who was there, but that's certainly something that those Conservative MPs will be thinking. And I think that will have been something that really kind of struck them and was quite an uncomfortable moment for them.
David Aldroyd, we can agree that these were not staunch Republicans who showed up on the day. Why were they booing?
I think because they, like the rest of the nation, are sickened by the moral cowardice of a man who imposes upon the nation draconian rules and regulations he knows to be unnecessary, which he himself and his staff break repeatedly in Downing Street, at a time when, as you said in your introduction, people were forbidden from seeing their dying relations, forbidden from sitting together at funerals, as we saw Her Majesty had to sit by herself in St. George's Chapel for the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. I think they're utterly fed up with a man who seems constitutionally incapable of either straightforward leadership. He should at the time have said, we now think that these rules are no longer necessary. We ourselves in Downing Street don't see a need to follow them, so you at home, you in the nation who have behaved so well will no longer need to follow them either. And they're also fed up with a man who quite simply lies and lies and lies until he's caught out. You cannot have the head of government behaving in this way in a civilized, moral nation. It's embarrassing for the United Kingdom.
David, we're having slight technical issues. Apologies, there's a bit of a burr on the sound on the audio. We're going to try to get that fixed as soon as possible. Apologies again for that. Catherine Cohen, the pandemic, it's still front and center in people's minds?
Of course it is, particularly if they have rules which are so hard. And I think it was longer in the UK than it was in France, for example, if we compare. I mean, for French people, we need to understand that last summer we were out while they were still having the lockdown. And all these rules have an impact on people. The Brexit has an impact also. Since autumn, inflation is there, job shortages, a kind of stagflation, a kind of time has started, and people are worried because of their cost of living, standard of living. This is part of the people. Now, I think as far as the Conservatives are concerned, they also think about general elections, which will take place in 2024. And maybe they are anticipating this, and they want to keep the power. So maybe they need to change Boris Johnson for this reason.
So the time is now and not later, is what you're saying.
Yes, that was to answer your first question.
Yeah.
In a way.
Sunny Kapoor, the British knew who they were voting for when they voted for Boris Johnson with his lovable rogue airs, and they gave him a big majority. Is it really about the pandemic, though, why there's a backbench revolt?
I think it's an accumulative effect of all of the things mentioned. I mean, the booing, for example, happening at the celebration of the Jubilee was almost definitely to do with the scenes of the Queen mourning alone in the chapel. The overall economic malaise that has set in is directly attributable as people compare how much worse the UK is doing compared to the other G7 countries, the other countries in the EU, is directly attributable to Brexit, and that becomes harder and harder to escape. the gimmickry that changes from day to day. The most recent to do with the reintroduction of imperial measures that, even the ministers talking about on TV were able to not remember and got completely wrong. So it's the blow by blow, impact of a government that is incompetent, incapable of delivering what people need, and without a plan, cast completely adrift at a time that the British economy is doing worse than in living memory of most people alive. And I think all of those things have really, really added up. And yes, you rightly said, people knew they were voting for a liar, a cheat, an incompetent buffoon, but they were promised sunlit uplands. And, enough time has now passed to know that we didn't get those. And as someone who was separated from my own parents for 2 years, and my mum was diagnosed with incurable cancer in the meantime, the very knowledge that many British citizens have now, that while they were separated from near and dear ones, many saw their loved ones die remotely on the phone, and they were the lucky ones, saw this party, the culture of just absolute impunity, no shame. And, that's the kind of shock to the moral fiber nobody recovers from. So I think that Boris Johnson is, politically a dead man walking. Whether he manages to muster enough support and, scrape through the confidence vote not today or not. It's just a matter.
But there are reports, Sonny, that he's dangled this threat of a snap election. Now, here in France, we remember 1997, when the then president, Jacques Chirac, had a majority, decided for a snap election, and of course it didn't go his way. It's a dangerous game, is it not? Because the leadership challenge could beget a snap election, and at which point anything goes.
It's true. And, there's also rumors circulating around. I'm sure almost untrue, that he's offered the foreign secretary post to, 20 candidates. And so clearly, the Johnson camp has been in full swing, trying to use everything from saying that Tory donors have, donated £80 million and want their money to, want the investment to be protected, to the threat of the snap election, to, I'm sure, lucrative jobs and, promises of honors and appointments to the House of Lords and knighthoods being floated around. But, he might survive this one. But this is not someone who has a very long-term political future in the United Kingdom, at least not in the next couple of political cycles.
Alice Lilly, there's a lot of side stories around this. It began during lockdown with the falling out with his communications chief, Dominic Cummings. A lot of the attention today has been on Boris Johnson's wife. Why is that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So Boris Johnson's wife, Carrie Johnson, is herself somebody with a lot of experience in politics. She previously held a role in the Conservative Party working in communications. And there have been all sorts of sort of rumours and stories about the relationships that she's had with various people around the Prime Minister. The idea that she's sort of fallen out with some of them, with people like Dominic Cummings, Lee Kane, all of these sorts of things. It's, of course, difficult to know how much any of that is actually true. A lot of this is kind of palace intrigue, as it were. But certainly it is something that there's been a lot of discussion about. The Prime Minister's wife,
sorry to interrupt, is there a slight whiff of misogyny when you complain, the leader, it's not the leader, it's his wife?
I think it's fair to say that there is in some of the reporting. Sometimes it does seem to fall into kind of Lady Macbeth type stereotypes of, the woman who's sort of exercising the power behind the Prime Minister. At the same time, it does seem to be the case that Mrs. Johnson does like to be involved in sort of some of what her husband does. So I think, to some extent, it is a discussion that's worth having, but I would agree that sometimes that does veer into sexism. Again, it comes down to the fact that, we don't know a huge amount about how things actually work in terms of 10 Downing Street, but something that we have seen time and time again with this Prime Minister is that he has often fallen out with people close to him, people like Dominic Cummings and so on. And, you do have to wonder at some point how sustainable that becomes. Will he eventually effectively kind of run out of friends and supporters?
Well, right now, the big guns inside the cabinet, quick to take to Twitter to show they're absolutely, positively, definitely have no intention whatsoever of stabbing the PM in the back. This is the tweet put out by the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. The Prime Minister has delivered on COVID recovery and supporting Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. He's apologized for mistakes made. Or if you want, the Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak saying, I'm backing him today and will continue to back him as we focus on growing the economy, tackling the cost of living, and clearing the COVID backlogs. Earlier, Sunny Kapoor, you talked about the government seeming a little rudderless. Wasn't Rishi Sunak the grown-up in the room of this cabinet?
There was a time when that was the perception, and he was talked about glowingly as the future prime minister. But a lot of that sheen has worn off. His name was dragged through the mud of British tabloid press, partly because of his own policies, his tone deafness to do with the statements he made and the reality of the very real poverty crisis and cost of living crisis in the UK. And allegations, mildly proven, somewhat, substantiated about his wife, who is the daughter of a very rich Indian billionaire, and and he's independently wealthy too. And their potential connections with tax havens and the fact that she was she was non-domiciled in the UK, was not paying UK tax. So I think he's quite wounded. He's definitely and in fact, perhaps Liz Truss is nowadays talked about as the leading candidate. But the bigger issue here is that first of all, the vote is confidential, right? So no matter what they say in public, how they vote it remains to be seen, and it's unknowable. And second, this is not a cabinet of Tory stars, right? These are not first-tier politicians in the United Kingdom. These are not the stars. I mean, many of the best talent, experienced people, and promising rising stars of the Conservative Party were unceremoniously ejected by Boris Johnson. And he's surrounded mostly by incompetents who have come out, actively lied, changed their minds about policies 100 times and said anything just to get elected. These are not top-tier politicians. So we do have a leadership crisis that goes beyond Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party today.
Catherine Cohen, is that a British problem where you have fewer strong personalities inside parties? It's been a criticism leveled against France's president.
Yes, I think it's the same criticism we have in France of people who started in politics without it's a real job, without knowing about the job. And so, yes, with time, it happened that they proved not to know about the job exactly, and they changed their minds, or they did things which were not, politically speaking, were not to be made.
On the issue of the problems Britain faces today and how Boris Johnson's handled the crisis, we've talked about COVID. Right now, though, you have inflation, which is at 9%, could go higher, highest in 4 decades, but we have inflation all over Europe. Could things have gone any differently?
Well, inflation is not the same in the UK and in the US. It has been very high since autumn. While, for example, in France, it is now reaching 5 or 6%, but it started only in March. And so we probably have an impact of job shortages for the UK.
So you can't blame the Prime Minister for that?
You can blame the Prime Minister for the Brexit. He was elected for that. And this is typically British, and this is probably one of the reasons why the UK is doing worse than the others.
Why does Brexit lead to more inflation?
Because of all, it adds to the shortages. You have less goods coming in. And you have also, we saw I came to see you, some transport, for example, truck drivers, all the hard works, people don't want to do them anymore. And particularly people who are not British. I mean, the British economy really relies on people who are not British to have their economy go on. So that's one of the reasons, probably.
All right, a tighter labor market leading to that higher inflation post-Brexit. Boris Johnson's tumultuous tenure, it's been only since 2019, not that long. It stands in stark contrast to that isle of stability in British politics known as the Queen. Her 96-year-old Royal Majesty appearing at the balcony of Buckingham Palace for the fourth and final day of Jubilee celebrations on Sunday. And it was interesting, David Alderweireld-Bolt, because the head of state, again, is this beacon of stability in Britain. And that also is a glaring contrast to what we're seeing in parliamentary politics today.
It is, but that's one of the benefits of a constitutional monarchy. And I think the imaging, the presentation of the royal family over the past 4 days has been particularly strong, showing that we have 4 generations of royalty there, with Her Majesty, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Cambridge, and Prince George. This is a system that will endure. It's a system that's been tested to the point of destruction more than once in the past 1,000 years and is shown to endure well.
But let me interrupt you, David. Let me interrupt you on that point, because we saw with the last Jubilee 10 years ago, there was this real feeling of a celebration. Here, there was almost a tinge of nostalgia, like it was a thanks. It wasn't so much a celebration, and a sense that you really sense it's the twilight of her monarchy. Is it a twilight in a sense, of a Britain that won't be the same after she's gone?
Well, of course it won't be the same after she's gone, because each monarch sets the tone for his or her monarchy. But I disagree that it wasn't a celebration. I think you only have to look at the images from the Mall on Saturday evening, when you had hundreds of thousands of people celebrating wildly. Look at all the pictures from around the country yesterday, where there were lunches going on, where there were street parties. And I think throughout the whole of the Jubilee weekend, we saw people celebrating. Naturally, there is a nostalgic air to all of this, because Her Majesty is 96 years old, in failing health, and coming to the end of an extraordinary tenure, second only, of course, to Louis XIV so far, as the world's longest-serving monarch. But I do think it was celebratory more than it was nostalgic. I do think that there was an air of jubilation more than there was an air of recession. I think perhaps the church service at St. Paul's Cathedral on Friday was the closest we came to any kind of recessional idea during the Jubilee weekend, but that is the nature of the Anglican ceremony of that sort. And compared with the sort of giddiness of the pop concert, I think it's good that we had some restraint. Her Majesty's own example is that of duty, restraint, self-abnegation and service, and I think it was just and right and appropriate that at least one of the aspects of those celebrations over the past 4 days reflected that.
Alice Lilly, it was certainly, we didn't hear booings of prime ministers at previous Jubilees, and did you, what sense do you get from this takeaway? Is there the Jubilee on the one hand and the political turmoil on the other, or are the two intertwined?
It's a really interesting question, and it's definitely felt a little bit like whiplash. You know, the past 24 hours, we've gone from these sort of 4 days of concerts and parades and sort of Thanksgiving services and lots of focus on the monarchy. And then suddenly this morning, we're straight back into a Conservative Party vote of no confidence in its leader. So that's been quite a sort of striking difference between the two things. I do think there's something interesting there about, you know, the stability, as you say. Queen Elizabeth having been on the throne for 70 years, she is the only monarch that an awful lot of British people can remember. You know, my generation, my parents' generation, even some of my grandparents can only remember the Queen. So that's a kind of remarkable stability that I think people do perhaps find a little comforting at a time when our politics is very up in the air, and when, quite frankly, our politics has also been up in the air, you know, for the last few years. But it has been quite the contrast the last day or two.
Sunny Kapoor, the twilight of the Queen, is it also the twilight of a certain Britain? There was a lot of stress, I know, on the Commonwealth. It's, you know, obviously not the same as it was perhaps in the past. Your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely yes. I mean, it's not, you know, there's no causation between the two, but they do coincide in time. And, you know, as Her Majesty's reign and health fade, we are at a place in our history which will probably, in retrospect, look as dramatic as the end of, you know, British colonialism. And if you recall that period, we spent sort of several years, decades even, as a declining power, trying to find our place in the world. And, you know, we finally eventually made our peace that we were a second-tier power. And we needed to team up with other second-tier powers in Europe to be a global force, as the European Union is. And, you know, having unceremoniously ejected ourselves out of it, and with the, you know, very rotten stench of rot at the top of the government, this is us in further decline, going to the next stage. And the study in contrast between the two characters at the top of the government, the head of the state and the head of the government, I mean, it's just glaring, right? I mean, on one hand is you know, a solemn woman, you know, the very picture of integrity, you know, public service minded. And right next to that is the image of a self-serving buffoon with a track record of misogyny, you know, gratuitous racism, and just total incompetence. And the nation sees it.
David Alroy-Bolt, the idea of global Britain that's been touted by Boris Johnson, but there is an air of sadness. Today is D-Day, and when we see the British soldiers who fought bravely to oust the Nazis on the Normandy beaches, who are over here, the last ones still alive today, there is this sense that it's all coming apart.
I disagree entirely, and I must take issue with Sonny's description of Britain as a second-tier power. It may be how he and other Remainers wish us to be. We are not. We are the fifth largest country in the world by GDP. We have growing trade relations all around the world. In terms of soft power, we have seen in Ukraine quite how hard we punch when we put ourselves into it. We are far from a second-tier power. And I'm sorry that our departure from a trade bloc has caused people to lose their sense of perspective and patriotism quite so much. Now, of course, as we see the last veterans of the Second World War declining and dying, just as we saw as with the veterans of the First World War, there is a moment for reflection. But that moment for reflection needn't be to reflect that we are declining in the world, because I don't see that that is true. And the earlier economic arguments that were made that somehow Brexit is uniquely responsible for making Britain poorer, I'm sorry, but inflation is a global problem. It's caused by the supply chains, and in this country particularly, the fact that so much of our internal freight depends on diesel, which has gone through the roof because of the war in Ukraine, has added to inflationary pressure. I think there's a lot of ill-wishing, frankly, from commentators on British politics who want to use Brexit as an excuse for everything that is wrong, to prove we were right, we were right. They're not right. There are so many competing global factors as to the problems that are undergone by the British economy at the moment. And to return to an earlier point that was made, we don't, in fact, have a jobs shortage in this country. We have a jobs surplus. We're one of the few European countries of which that's the case. And we have not lost foreign workers. As a Spectator demonstrated last week in Fraser Nelson's column, we have now more foreign workers than we've ever had in this country. So I think it must be countered, this idea of Brexit decline, because it isn't true. There are a great many things that this country is trying to change about itself, to reflect upon, but it is not one of inexorable decline.
Catherine Cohen?
Well, I totally disagree, because, as I was saying, the UK is now having stagflation, which was the case after World War II. I agree with the fact that Brexit is not the only problem, the only issue, but inflation is higher in the UK than it is in France and in Germany, for example. We have to compare the UK to Germany and France. And cost of living is higher in the UK due to Brexit. There are job shortages, because I agree there are job shortages in all countries today, as far as education is concerned, or in health sector too. So problem is that this problem of inflation started before in the UK than what it did in France, and stagflation is now threatening all our economies. We have to do something against these job shortages, which are real. So if we don't address this issue, the UK will be the same as it was in the 70s, when finally the only person who could do it was Margaret Thatcher, with a very hard kind of policy, because it had lasted too long. Going out of stagflation is very difficult. And the only central banks which have started having a kind of impact trying to on inflation, it didn't have any impact, unfortunately. So they did something on interest rates, but increasing them, but it didn't have any impact. So there is a real issue, and who is going to be at the command is important, and somebody who doesn't lie and somebody who who doesn't break the rule would be probably better for the country. Again, this is my outsider view on that.
So, Sunny Kapoor, is it too soon to speak of stagflation?
Not at all. And just before I go there, I shall not have my patriotism questioned on live TV by someone who voted to destroy our country's reputation and tarnish its economy and international image. There are two kinds of people: those who say, when the facts change, I change my mind. And sir, you Brexiters such as yourself, who basically come up with alternative facts to a narrative they champion. All facts point to the deep economic damage that Brexit has done. The shortage of workers across various sectors is very real. It's caused by many EU citizens who have left, who don't feel welcome, who don't want to come back. And the cost of living crisis is real. The inflation problem is much worse in the UK. Our growth is much worse. So yes, if one G7 country were closest to stagflation today, it would probably be the United Kingdom. Now, if Russia were to cut off the gas, then clearly Germany and Italy and some of the other EU countries, large EU countries, would be in even more trouble. But right now, the UK is the worst performing G7 country, and a significant chunk, as much as between a third and half of that underperformance, can be directly attributed to Brexit. And anyone else who doesn't acknowledge that is basically coming with alternative facts, aka Donald Trump.
Let's not go there, because time is running short. But Alice Lilly, let me ask you, within the Conservative Party, what are the sort of schools of thought when it comes to tackling the current crisis?
Well, I think this is one of the big challenges that's facing the Prime Minister, one of many challenges that he's facing at the moment, which is the cost of living crisis is definitely beginning to bite in the UK, and there is a good chance that that will only get worse, particularly as we head into the winter and people may well struggle to afford to heat their own homes. But what's been quite notable is that it's taken the government a little while to actually start unveiling kind of concrete packages of what they're going to do about that. So we had a statement from the Chancellor a couple of weeks ago, just a couple of days after that Sue Gray report into Partygate. And that was really the first time that we've actually seen the government sort of start to set out those kinds of concentrated measures. But the reality is that there is likely to have to be more that the government does as this goes on and as things begin to bite and affect people's pockets more and more. And it's not really entirely clear yet exactly sort of what the government's big long-term strategy for dealing with this cost of living crisis is. And it's been so notable that, the last few days, as it's looked more and more like the Prime Minister will face this vote of confidence, the thing that the government's tried to say is, we welcome this vote, we want to draw a line under this issue and get back to dealing with the things that people are concerned about, like the cost of living crisis. But the flip side of that is that they need to have something to say that they're going to do. And at the moment, we don't really know what that will look like. So I think that's certainly something that people will be looking out for, whoever is Prime Minister in the coming months.
David Alroy-Bode, can Boris Johnson, if he survives this vote of confidence, can he be the one to steer the ship?
No, absolutely not. He has absolutely no idea of macroeconomics. He seems to hand over, the moment that any question of detail comes up, he hands it over to someone else to deal with. And he has a chancellor in Mr. Sunak, who I'm afraid is clearly not up to the job, because his answer to all questions seems to be financial stimulus, fiscal stimulus, which will only fuel inflation. There seems to be absolutely no idea of reviving the enterprise culture of the 80s by cutting taxes, by stimulating growth, by encouraging people to open businesses, and by encouraging inward investment.
It's
So
something
I'm
that the
afraid at
Prime
moment
Minister
all we have,
reportedly promised. It's something the Prime Minister reportedly promised in a closed-door meeting before the vote earlier.
Well, I think if we were to make a list of everything Boris Johnson has promised and everything Boris Johnson has actually followed through on, it would be rather heavy in the debit column. But I just don't think he's the right man for the job. He was the right man to deliver Brexit, and in the past he's been a very good mayor of London, a good figurehead. But when things are really difficult, when questions of detail and of policy have to be weighed up, he's not the man, because his natural instinct is to delegation, and as has been mentioned earlier, unfortunately the cabinet is not at the moment of the very highest quality. And those people in the senior positions, such as Mr. Sunak and Ms. Patel, don't seem to be up to their jobs. I would make an exception for Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, who's performed extremely well over Ukraine, and possibly for Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, depending on the situation. But I don't see that Mr. Johnson has the ability to guide us out of these economic woes. I don't see that he has the focus on detail nor the knowledge of finance.
We've talked about inflation. We've talked about cost of living. There's a part of the United Kingdom right now where there's a full-blown constitutional crisis already. Platinum Jubilee celebrations in Northern Ireland included a visit by Prince Edward to Belfast, the unveiling of a mural honouring the Queen on the Shankill Road. That's a unionist stronghold, with the DUP currently blocking the regional government from sitting after losing recent elections there. The ire across the sectarian divide isn't so much directed against the Queen as her Prime Minister.
Boris Johnson must, and the British government must come off this very, very destructive path, because they put in peril, they put in jeopardy the peace and the Good Friday Agreement settlement that we have all built so painstakingly over decades.
Alice Lilly, is it all just a bit of saber rattling on the part of the British government, a distraction to talk about tearing up that post-Brexit trade deal that keeps the land border open between the two Irelands? Or if Boris Johnson's in trouble, could he push what he's saying?
I think there's a whole lot of moving parts to this. I mean, certainly the last few weeks, we've seen some kind of bigger noises coming from the government about potentially tearing up the Northern Ireland Protocol or getting rid of certain bits of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Whether that will actually happen yet, we don't know. There's been talk that they might introduce a bill in the UK Parliament that would do that, but we're still in a bit of a waiting game on that. And that's because of some of those other moving parts. So, of course, we had elections across the UK a few weeks ago, and including in Northern Ireland for the Northern Irish Assembly. So there's now an effort to try and form a new executive there. So that obviously has an impact on what might happen, with the protocol. There is the government's current political situation as well. And there's, of course, concern from people across Northern Ireland, both Unionists and Republicans, about what all of this might mean for the peace accords and for the Good Friday Peace Agreement. So it's very much a kind of, moving situation. Obviously, what that means is that there is a huge amount of uncertainty for people living in and doing business in Northern Ireland. And I think that's something that's proving very difficult for a lot of people. But at the moment, it is something that we have to add to that long column of things that we just don't quite know yet what will unfold.
Don't know quite yet how it will unfold. And again, at the outset, we talked about these two by-elections that are happening later this month. One of those is in the north. The transformation of UK politics didn't start with Brexit in 2016. Back in 2010, if you look at this map comparing general elections, Labour still ruled the north and in parts of Scotland. The Conservatives in 2010 squeaked into power thanks to a coalition with the centrist pro-EU Liberal Democrats. And of course, Catherine Cohen, it's changed a lot over that time. Boris Johnson credited with breaking the so-called red wall in the north of England. What's your feeling on that? Those areas, Rustbelt areas for many of them, where industry isn't what it used to be. This is where the future hinges, to a degree.
Well, as an old outsider viewer, maybe, I mean, it's a long time since the Conservative came to power, and we may see that after a long time of Conservative, we often have a long time of Labour. That was 10 years approximately Labour, 10 years Conservatives. And due to the fact that cost of living is really an issue for people in the UK, maybe, yes, we may see a change in future elections because it's very difficult for people to cope with life and with what we've been living with due to COVID-19. I mean, COVID-19 had an impact. People had time to think about many things and maybe reflect about what they could change, how they could change.
Sunny Kapoor, when you think back again to how much Britain has changed since 2010, your thoughts either way, no matter what the result of this confidence vote is, on which way Britain is headed politically?
I think we are going to be in very difficult times, potentially volatile politically, because promises will be made by both sides and upstart parties, unrealistic promises, which find fertile ground in uncertain times where people feel economically insecure. So maybe I think the UK is going to see what the rest of the continent saw for a number of years post-financial crisis, post-Euro crisis, where the mindset one has, the expansive, inclusive mindset one has, the outwardly looking one, when the size of the pie is expanding and your share of it, even if it remains the same or shrinks a bit, but tomorrow looks better than today. The politics of tomorrow looking better than today are very different from the politics of decline. And I'm afraid that the UK is in for the next several years for a politics of decline, which will be uncertain, populist, volatile, and will make the UK even harder to govern and will not help with the economic challenges we need to meet.
David Allward-Bolt, you made the argument that what is needed now is a steady hand at the helm that's on top of a big caseload. Listening to Sunny Kapoor, do you agree that what Britain may get is more volatility, more vitriol?
I think Mr. Kapoor is right that it could well do if the present course of policy is followed. And I think that the problem has been that for a great deal of the past 12 years, which has been under majority Conservative government, the policies have not been terribly different from the ones that preceded it under Labour. There was a little slowdown in the expanse of the state under George Osborne as Chancellor, but there weren't cuts, not real cuts. There was not an effort to shrink the state and increase the size of the private sector. And a great many of the things that we're seeing now are a direct consequence of that. The inflation that we suffer in this country, for instance, is partly a consequence of the enormous amount of money pumped into the system under various governors of the Bank of England for quantitative easing, to try and essentially to inflate our way out of recession, which succeeded for a while. And then we have eventually to pay the price of this. We have to pay the price of the gargantuan borrowing that this country has indulged itself with over the past 25 years. And I think unless we have a really inventive chancellor, a chancellor who understands macroeconomics, who understands how to use the tax system to encourage people to start businesses and increase the general tax yield so that taxes can be lowered and people's cost of living crisis is ameliorated, I think it's likely we will have extremely difficult times ahead. Whether that
Alice
takes
Lilly,
the
because
form of
we're
populism
out
from
of
left
time.
or right,
We're out of time.
who
So
knows?
we're out of time. Alice Lilly, just in 10 seconds, are we headed for more volatility no matter what?
I mean, very possibly. I think there's a good chance that Boris Johnson will win this vote tonight, but perhaps not by as much as was expected. And that's likely to mean that the party of government itself remains divided for some time to come. So I think that is also likely to increase political volatility in the medium and long term.
Alice Lilly, I want to thank you so much for being with us from London. David Oldroyd Bolt, I want to thank Sunny Kapoor in Oslo. Catherine Goron, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you, François.